Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Jarby Laws, and this is your co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all support on our recent content with the playoffs fast approaching. We're going to be taking a look at some standings, battles, and, some teams that could potentially be in trouble. Before that, though, we hit a huge milestone of 50 subscribers, so thank you to each and every one of our subs. It wasn't possible without you all. Our next goal is 100 subs, so before we get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter, or TikTok, at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
We really do appreciate those 50 subs.
Yes, we do.
Continue to grow the channel. No comments to read today, in terms of being left on, any videos, but so we'll just get right into it. So the first couple of things that we're going to look at initially is some injury updates, right? So Brandon Ingram, I believe the last time we recorded, there wasn't, like a diagnosis or whatever on what his specific injury was, and now we know. He's got a bone contusion in his left knee, so he's going to be reevaluated in 2 weeks. So, on the one hand, that's good news that his season isn't over. And he's not ruled out for the playoffs or anything like that. So that's always good, right? Because especially, given his injury history, right? He's had some seasons where he's missed a lot of time. Obviously, in the short term, it's not great for New Orleans, right? Because Ingram has been, one of their best players, right? For a long stretch of the season, he kind of was their best player, right? Zion's turned it up, as of late, but for a while, right? I mean, Ingram was kind of clearly the best guy. I think now, right, given where Zion is in terms of how he's playing, I think they can probably still win a decent chunk of their remaining regular season games. Without Ingram, as long as Zion continues to play at a high level. The first game without him, right, Zion didn't really score at all. I think he had 4 points in the game, right? So really didn't have to do much of anything because other guys were able to do, were kind of able to pick up the slack, right? And that's kind of another thing where, like, because of the depth that New Orleans has, they have a lot of different options to go to, right? A guy like a Trey Murphy who comes off the bench. Now he's in the starting five. And, obviously he doesn't create shots offensively like Ingram does, right? But he can play off of Zion pretty well. He can shoot, right? He's got length. Obviously he takes a lot of threes, over the course of a game, right? I mean, recently he's been taking like what, close to 10 attempts a game, at a 40+% clip, which is what you want, right, out of a guy like that, right? You want a guy next to Zion, whose job basically is to space the floor. So I think in the short term, again, you don't feel good, but, hopefully he can come back. I mean, reevaluation dates, it is not very often, especially in this day and age, that guys come back at that time, right? That probably means after 2 weeks, they're going to see where he's at. And then maybe after that, maybe he might return in the next week or so, or maybe he doesn't. You just don't know with those type of injuries because it just kind of depends on how he responds, right? But that's the main good news. And, right now, they're, kind of in that 4 or 5 spot, right? I think the Clippers right now, have the 4 seed, but it's only by like half a game essentially, right? Like, when you think about it, because the Clippers lost a few hours, I think, before we recorded, right? They lost to the Sixers. They got, kind of blown off the floor, without, Embiid, for the Sixers. And we'll get into the Clippers in a moment because that's another injury we have to talk about. But I think with New Orleans, the biggest thing right now is the fact that Zion has been playing at a much higher level than he was earlier in the season. A lot of the things that we talked about that we were frustrated with that he wasn't doing, now he is, right? Stuff like defense, rebounding, things that we know that he should be capable of doing, but for whatever reason, he just wasn't, right? Like there was a stretch, I think it was January, right? So that was like, not long after the in-season tournament where he was averaging like 3-4 rebounds a game, which is just, to me, just kind of unacceptable for a guy of that size.
Agreed.
And strength. But now he's averaging, for the month of March, right, like 22 points, 7.5 rebounds, which is much more what you want to see. 4.5 assists, right? He just had a game against the Pistons, right, where he had like 37 or whatever, missed one shot. Looks explosive, looks really good. So I think that's the positive sign for New Orleans is that the depth is there. Zion's playing really well. You just kind of have to hope that you get Brandon Ingram back, for this extended postseason run. Because, I think they have a pretty good shot of avoiding. I don't think they're going to be in the play-in now. I think they're going to be like probably in that 4 or 5 spot.
Okay.
They do have some tough games, I think, to close out the season, and it's tougher without Ingram. But if they can win some of those games, right, they'll have a good shot. So I think, again, the main thing is get Ingram back, and if you get him back, you should be doing pretty good.
Yeah, I'm pretty scared of the ramifications of this one because I'm just looking at the standings right now, and they're in an awkward position where they're above the
Right.
bunch that's kind of like competing, and like the guys that are gonna or the teams that are gonna be going up and down pretty much every week or every day, pretty much. But they're right above those teams, and they're in the danger zone. If they lose a couple in a row, I think they could potentially get into that spot and become one of those teams where they're going to be bouncing up and down every single day because somebody's winning and somebody's losing. So that would be my only concern with them. And like you said, I think this is time for Zion to step up potentially even more because I think he has what it takes in terms of the game and the talent. I think it's just a matter of effort level, and I think he should feel. He should feel a little bit more driven now, to prove that he really is the guy. Because it's crazy to even think about, like in the off season, people were really talking about moving on from Zion Williamson, which is crazy. But I think he's proving
Never
potentially.
wavered.
Yeah, exactly. But like he's proving. I think that he could be the guy potentially. But I think, we just need to see a little bit more. And I think this is the ripe opportunity. But like I said, I think it could go pretty poorly or it could go very well. Like, I think they're in a unique position also where like the Clippers, like you were talking about them, they haven't really looked all that great recently. There's been times where they look okay, but, they just lost a game. But, if they could potentially win, it would be intriguing to see them go up to 4. Like if they win out, like we could be talking about them differently, and then getting back Brandon Ingram would be a huge help and a huge lift in the playoffs. But I'm just worried that they slip because I think realistically they're better than all the teams that are above them in terms of chemistry. Maybe not in terms of like the upper talent level. Like Zion's not on a Luka Doncic level or a Kevin Durant level yet. But, as a team and cohesiveness and coaching and things like that and the way that they're structured and built, I think they're better than, I guess a Sacramento, Dallas, Phoenix, teams like that. So, it would really suck for them to go into the play-in, and I think that's what they should be avoiding at all costs is the play-in.
So you mean that they're better than the teams below them?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Did I misspeak and say like above them or something?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, below them is what I meant. Sorry for the confusion.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, like, because again, they've been playing really well as of late. So I
Yeah.
think, that's kind of the first thing that you feel good about, right? It's just you got to get Ingram back and healthy. If you can get him back and healthy, I think regardless of whether they're 4 or 5, they'd have a shot to beat the Clippers. I'm not saying they will,
Hmm.
but I think they have a much better shot now than they would have, say like a couple months ago where they were just kind of playing uneven basketball. But, since that weird in-season tournament moment, right, they've been way better. So I mean, that's thing that you got to give it up to for New Orleans. And I think a lot of it starts with Zion, in addition to other guys on the roster, because again, they have a ton of depth. So even without Ingram, you still have Trey Murphy, who's really good. He's not Ingram, but he's still a really good option as a wing player.
Sure.
That you can put out there for a lot of teams would like to have a guy like that. So,
Yeah. Good point.
like you said, to be fair, it could go either way because they don't necessarily have like the easiest schedule
Right.
in the world to finish the season. There are some tougher matchups that, again, without Ingram, may be a little bit tougher. But this is kind of what you get the depth for, where you have like 2 star guys and then a bunch of solid role players or depth guys around them. Where like this is where like a CJ McCollum should be able to step up offensively.
Yeah.
Or maybe you get a really good performance off the bench, from one of those guys like Alvarado or Larry Nance or something like that, So that's kind of, I think, what you should look to if you are, New Orleans.
For sure.
Yeah. And then moving on, another injury return. This one is a guy that's close to coming back, right? And that's Russell Westbrook, right? Obviously, if you remember a little while ago, he fractured his hand,
Mhm.
right? And so I think the initial thought process was that he'd probably be back closer to the end of the regular season. But now, Woj and others think that he could be back, basically on Monday, right? So, like, this episode will be out on Monday. We're recording on Sunday. So that's good news, right? Because I think, when you look at the Clippers, since Westbrook's been out, they've kind of been, uneven, right? I think, they won, basically since Westbrook's been out, they've been a 500 team, right? So I mean, they just lost it earlier today, right, to the Sixers, right? They
Mhm.
had the 2 wins against the Blazers, then they played the Sixers without Embiid and lost. So they just haven't been as good as of late. I think to be fair, they were starting to slip a little bit before Westbrook got hurt anyways. And you also kind of look at it from the perspective of, well, they went 33 and 11, right? So they had a long stretch where they were winning almost 80% of the, 75% of their games.
Mhm.
And that's just probably not sustainable. It's the oldest team in the NBA. So there's probably going to be a point where they're going to run out of gas, right? I think also at this point, a top 3 seed is out of reach, right? Because I think they were the 1 seed around the All-Star break. Um, I think if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah,
They were
you're right.
basically right there. Um, but now that 1, 2, 3 seed is pretty much out of reach. So there's a certain level that I think they can probably maintain where like they're not going to completely drop. It's just again, if you lose too many games, right, then you have the issue of okay, well now you're the 5 seed, right, and you have to be on the road against New Orleans, and not that you can't beat New Orleans in New Orleans, right, but it just wouldn't be a good feeling, to kind of close the regular season, right? Basically at a 500 clip. But what goes up must come down. So that was going to happen eventually. And I think with Westbrook, him being out, right, you miss his energy. His rebounding from the guard spot. There's just some things that he brings where, like, let's say if the Clippers, are kind of playing sort of flat, and then he kind of just comes in and just changes things up and shakes things up, and then all of a sudden everybody's kind of pumped up. Right, these are things where, like, maybe the stats don't necessarily kind of, you know, justify it or, kinda show that, but
Yeah.
I think if you watch a lot of the Clippers games this year, I think you can see he definitely does make a difference. Obviously, there's gonna be games where he just doesn't really do much, right? Because obviously, the jump shooting is up and down. And if it's like a team where they just kind of put the center on him and just kind of dare him to either shoot or just attack a 7-footer, that might be kind of tough. So I think they do need him if they want to make a stretch run, right? And obviously, to be fair, there was a stretch where I think both him and Powell were out, and both of those guys are basically their 6 men guys. Especially Powell's kind of the scoring guard. So now that those guys are on their way back, Powell was already back, Westbrook's coming back. That should help. I still don't feel quite as good about the team as I did, like, say, a couple months ago,
Mhm.
right? But I think they could still probably make some noise. It's just obviously at this point, when you look at most championship teams, usually you got to be a top 3 seed. It doesn't seem like they're going to be a top 3 seed. Obviously, Minnesota is a wild card because of the cat injury. We don't know when he's coming back. Um, if he comes back like at the start of the playoffs or if he just kind of just misses the first round.
Right.
OKC, right, because of their youth, right? That's the other factor where, maybe if they play a bad matchup, maybe they have a first round exit, who knows, or maybe they just go to the conference finals. Um, so you would think the Clippers would be like the second most stable option after the Nuggets, just because they have more experience and they already have a guy in Kawhi who we know, is a big playoff guy. I don't know. It just feels kind of just uneven, as of late. But I could just be off, and it could just be by the time they're in real playoff basketball, they'll kind of just figure it out because it's kind of do or die for them, right? Because I mean, this is the last season in the crypto.com arena before they go in. And, this is probably their best shot, to win a title, right? Because if they don't, then you got to factor in, okay, going into the offseason, right? Going into next year, right? You'd assume if Memphis gets healthy, right, they'd have a better shot to make the playoffs than they did this year,
Mhm.
right? And then teams like Houston or San Antonio, right? Maybe they kind of trade for somebody and then they kind of elevate into the playoff conversation. And then obviously the other teams, right? Like Denver's still going to be around. You assume New Orleans and Dallas and some of these other teams will still be hanging around. So I think it's going to be tougher for them. So they kind of need to shape up, or else, they're going to be looking at another, rough postseason, and then you're going to still have a lot of questions, going into the offseason.
Yeah, and it's like, back to the whole Russell Westbrook injury thing. He's averaging like 11 points per game, 5 rebounds, 4 assists. So, like you said, nothing crazy, but regardless, without him, you don't have those kinds of numbers that are being put up every night. And he's really the commander of their second unit, which I think is very underrated, and people tend to undervalue that because most great teams and most championship quality teams do have that one guy who kind of just keeps everybody level-headed on the bench and knows what they're doing. Because, I mean, if you really look at the bench for the Clippers, it's an awkward lineup, I would say, where you have guys like Tice, you have Plumlee, Coffee, Brandon Boston Jr. Like, none of these guys really scream, you know, level-headed and secure, and I know Westbrook sometimes plays sporadic, but, as a teammate, I think he does a lot more that isn't really reflected in the box score, like you were saying. So to have him back, I think will add some sense of stability to the bench, which is something that I think they desperately do need. Because in my opinion, you can't really be just losing games like this one. I think this was more of a throwaway game where you played against Philly without Embiid, and I think you should, wholeheartedly just destroy this Philadelphia team. Not to say that Philly's horrible, but I think the Clippers are just leagues above them, and that's kind of just a game where you pretty much threw and sold. But I think if Westbrook was there, they might have had a better chance because he's able to calm down the bench and just mitigate some of the awkwardness. And he's even a guy where you can throw in, if Harden's struggling or something like that, and maybe give Harden a break, give Harden some rest. And I'm not saying, the whole game was on Harden because, he put up a double-double. It's just the efficiency where he wasn't shooting threes, even though Westbrook wouldn't add threes as well. But I think he would do something in terms of just giving Harden a break. And I think that's kind of a key thing that we do have to be on the lookout for in the playoffs, because I think he's a huge X factor for them going into the playoffs, because if he plays very well and very efficiently coming off the bench, I mean, that could be a difference maker in a series and, could potentially win them like a game 7 or something like that if they do go to that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's kind of the key, right? Because again, like you said, you need a guy off the bench, that is comfortable, kind of creating stuff for other people in the second unit. So, like you said, obviously there's flaws, to Westbrook's game. I mean,
yeah,
there's no questions about that. But again, as a whole, right? If you can get like 15 to 20 good minutes of him, right, that's better than just probably not having him at all. Unless a guy like a Norman Powell is just on a heater where it's kind of just like give him the ball and get out of his way. Or something like that. And like you said, it gives you a little bit more help where like if one of the starters is struggling, you can put Westbrook out there and that can kind of help you out. Yeah, because that's the thing, right? Because again, like it's a rough loss, for the Clippers, right? Because again, and there's been a lot of these lately. Now, I mean, in fairness to Philly, I guess we might as well get into it now, right? Like, you look at the standings, in the NBA, and they're still crazy, right? Where they're changing any and every day of the week, right? Basically, any day that ends in Y, the standings change. And the thing with a team like Philly is that they have to win, these games because even though they're not in the same spot as the Clippers, they're still in a spot where they don't want to, drop in the standings, right? They're the 8th seed right now, right? Like Miami, they destroyed the Cavs. So, Miami is the 7th seed. I think they have the tiebreaker over Philly, and Philly is the 8th seed, right? So the thing about Philly is that they're not going to play, even though Embiid's out, they're going to play hard because they know that they have to win a lot of these games or win as many games as they can, while Embiid is out. Like you don't want to be 9, 10. They're not going to be because they built up enough wins before Embiid got hurt. But, you wouldn't want it. The last thing you would want is a situation where, like, you're the 8th seed and, you're in a play-in game. And then, if you win, right, you're 7, you play the Bucks in the first round. And then if you lose, right, you have one more chance to win. And then your reward is either you play the Celtics in the first round, right? And which is not great. It's not like they have a 0% chance of beating Boston. It's just in round 1 is not ideal.
For sure.
With Embiid just coming back from injury, or you're out of the playoffs if you lose both playing games, right? Because that's the thing that you don't want, right? Like you have to play a high stakes game before you even get into the playoffs. And that's kind of the thing about the standings now is that say for the Clippers, they're not in danger of, I don't think, of falling into the play-in, right? They have 26 losses. So, like, to be fair, Sacramento has 3 more losses than the Clippers,
which is crazy, bro.
Yeah, but like I don't think the Clippers are gonna like just fall into the play-in. You know what I mean?
I get you.
Yeah, so there's just like I think a level of comfort that they may have that some of these other teams don't have or shouldn't.
For sure.
Right?
Like New Orleans included. That's pretty much what we were talking about. Like New Orleans is not in a comfortable spot.
Right, and like and again in the East, seeds 6 through 8, or 5 through 4 through 8 are 4 losses apart, right? Like the Knicks are the 4 seed; they have 28 losses. They actually have the same losses as the Cavs because the Cavs have gone on a losing streak. So there's a chance for the Knicks to kind of sneak up to 3,
Yeah.
which I think they would probably want.
Yeah.
If I had to
I
guess.
think they would want that.
Yeah. And then the Magic are 5 with 29, then the Pacers at 31, and then the Heat and the Sixers at 32, right? So, that's kind of the thing with, the playing right now. There's basically 10, 12 games left for most of these teams. So a lot of these teams are in a mode where they kind of need to try to win as many games as they can, right? You look
For
at the
sure.
Heat and the Sixers, they've not really been good the last 10 games. They're 4-6. And they just won games today that got them to 4-6, right? So, those teams were not doing that hot, right? Like Chicago and Atlanta are pretty much locked into where they are, right? Like they're not dropping out of the play-in. So, I mean, like, so what they do doesn't necessarily matter.
Yeah.
But, from 3 to 8, every game kind of matters at this point, right?
Yeah.
Like the only team in the East, and honestly, the only team in the NBA that's kind of, shored up their standings is Boston, right?
Sure.
Like Boston has clinched, the one spot, in the East. I think they have the best record in the East by I think they have 11 less losses than the Bucks. So
Yes, they do.
they're running away with it, and then they're going to have home court, regardless of who comes out in the West as well. So they're at a point now where they can kind of just, if a guy's kind of hurt, they can just sit him, right? Because they basically clinched everything up, so they don't really have to do a whole lot at this point. But all these other teams, everything's, coming down to the wire. Like, in the Eastern Conference, again, a couple of bad losses can, move you from 6 to 8, and a couple of good wins can move you from 5 to 4 or 5 to 3.
Yeah. And it's bound to happen.
Right. So and the Cavs, right? They have a bunch of injuries right now. Like Mitchell's been out, Mobley's been out, Strus has been out. There are others that are playing, but obviously, like when your best player is out, your margin for error is a lot tougher. So, now they've lost 3 in a row, and where initially they were the 3 seed, possibly maybe be able to steal the 2 seed. Now it's a lot more likely that they're 3, but oops, now that they've lost 3 in a row, if they lose a couple more, they might drop to 4 or 5, right? Which is, basically where they were last year, which is probably not what you'd want. So that's the issue right there. So do you think that Cleveland holds on to the 3 seed, or do you think they ultimately kind of just relinquish it and then a team like the Knicks or even like Orlando just kind of swoops in? Because again, they're the Knicks and the Cavs have the same amount of losses. So, and then the Magic just have one more loss than the Cavs. So, if and the Knicks and the Magic are 7-3 in their last 10, and the Cavs are 3-7 in their last 10. So,
I mean, all signs are pretty much pointing to the Cleveland Cavaliers fumbling this seed. I think it's going to go right into the hands of New York. I think they're going to pick it up, which I think is kind of what we thought was going to happen with New York. I think everybody thought that,
right.
Yeah, exactly. Like post all the acquisitions and stuff like that, we thought they were going to probably be the 3 seed, which is where I think a lot of people thought they were going to go and want them to be, because I think they deserve it, because, heck of a team right there. But regardless, I mean, Cleveland's kind of just hit this really, really tough wall where, they've been stuck with injuries, but they try and fight, but sometimes you can just tell that it's just not enough. And that's what happens when you're missing a couple of your key guys, like Evan Mobley for sure. Like what he brings to their team on the defensive end, I think is rivaling a lot of top players in the NBA. It's just, his offense is a little bit shaky here and there. But regardless, you can't really substitute that out. And you can see it in the standings. That's why they're on a losing streak and other teams are kind of winning and creeping up. And, my thing with Miami and Philly is those are 2 teams, in my opinion, that can't really afford to be in the play-in. Miami, I just think, if they're in the play-in, they could potentially run out of gas a little bit quicker. And then with Philly, I don't think you want Embiid to be in the play-in, because like you said, you'd be versing Boston or Milwaukee, either way. So it's pretty much a lose-lose, honestly. But from Miami's point of view, you definitely don't want to be in there. I think that's even what we said when we appeared on the Miami Heat Zone podcast. So, it's kind of just the same old stuff where the top teams with some really good players and expensive rosters just don't be in the play-in. But then you've got some young and hungry teams like Orlando and Indiana, where they're not going to go down without a fight. Like you said, Orlando is chasing right behind New York. So it could be New York just goes and fumbles it too. And then Orlando's the 3 seed. Now we're talking a whole different ball game. like you
Right.
said, the teams outside of 10, they're not doing anything. We really don't even care about Chicago and Atlanta. Like, no offense, Chicago and Atlanta Hawk fans, but like, I mean, I don't think, they're going to be a potential factor in the playoffs, but, it's tight. It's intriguing. The problem is it just changes every day. Like, it's probably going to change by the time this episode comes out tomorrow.
Yeah. And
That's the
like, you know,
problem.
the Bulls. Yeah, the Bulls and Hawks, they're 9-10, so they'd have to win two just to be the 8th seed again,
Right.
just to get the right to get creamed by the Celtics or the Bucks.
Exactly. It's a
No,
lose-lose.
not the Bucks. I forgot, not the Bucks, because they only have a chance to be in the 8th seed, so then they'd have the chance to get the cream by the Celtics.
Yeah.
So, and like you mentioned, even the Pacers, right? They're 6-4 in their last 10.
Mm-hmm.
And Halliburton, is starting to look better, I think, in some
Yeah.
of these last few games, right?
Thank
like
God,
the game
bro.
like the game against Golden State was probably one of his best performances on both ends of the floor in quite some time, right? Like it
Yeah.
wasn't just the fact that he was, kind of going back to hitting some shots off the dribble, getting some tough drives around the rim.
Mhm.
He was also playing some really good defense, right? Like
For
if you
sure.
go and watch, like right, he got I think he had 4 steals, 3 blocks in that game. Again, against the Warriors team that just like the Pacers is also trying to win, a lot of these games. And that's
Can
kind
we
of the
talk about
interesting
them,
part.
bro? Please, we need to
Right.
talk about them. 'Cause, oh my God.
We'll get to the West in a moment. But and that's kind of the interesting thing is that again, like we mentioned, because Boston's really the only team that's short up in the standings, there's not a whole lot of teams right now that are kind of in the mode of like, all right, we just need to get healthy so we can kind of just chill and take a back seat, right? Like because like every team, all these standings are basically up for grabs. But let's go to the West. So we'll get to the Warriors in a moment, but out west, right? Now the Nuggets, right? The Thunder, they got smashed by the Bucks, right? And now the Bucks, Middleton's back, so they're pretty much, kind of back to being fully healthy now, which is
Mhm.
good. They're 6-4 in their last 10, so I think they're starting to look a lot more like a dangerous team,
For sure.
which is good. But OKC, right? They were the 1 seed. Denver now they're half a game ahead. We don't know how it's going to end, right? OKC has the tiebreaker between the Nuggets and the Thunder, right? So if they finish with the same record, OKC is going to overtake them. But I think the Nuggets schedule, I think is slightly easier. I mean,
Mhm.
like I'm not going to say that like either team has like a cakewalk schedule. It's just you know just in general.
I mean, Denver
You know
plays the Grizzlies twice, but I don't know what
exactly
OKC's looks like.
right. Like yeah, and I just looked right according to Tankathon, the Nuggets have the 29th hardest schedule. So
Yeah,
that
they
basically
got it,
means
bro.
yeah. So I mean that basically means that they have one of the easiest schedules,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, oh whoops, oh you might want to cut that part out
Why?
because I was on the wrong page.
Oh.
Let's just start over. Yeah. So then you look at Denver's strength of schedule. They have the 22nd, toughest schedule. So that basically means they have one of the easiest schedules,
Yeah.
right? Like they have one of the 10 easiest remaining schedules. Like you mentioned, they play the Grizzlies twice, they play the Spurs twice, they play the Jazz and the Hawks. They do have some games against Minnesota. I think 2 more against the Wolves, right? One against the Clippers, one against the Cavs, and one against the Suns. Um, and again, the 2 Wolves games, those are kind of important, right? Because
Yeah.
obviously, if the Nuggets or if the Wolves could win a couple of those 2 Denver games, right? Then they could split the season series, and then that may be the difference between because for a little while Minnesota was the 1 seed, and Minnesota's schedule is just one spot up over the Nuggets, where they have the 21st toughest schedule.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at OKC, they have the 7th hardest remaining schedule in the NBA. So obviously, OKC is a really good team, so they could just win all of them. But in their remaining games, right? They have the Celtics. They just played the Bucks. They played them? Have they played them before this game today?
I don't think so because I think they're gonna play them again down the line, like
So yeah,
in like the
so they're
last
playing
week of the season.
right. So they're playing the Celtics, the Bucks, the Pelicans, the Knicks, the Suns, and the Kings. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So Celtics may be the one where they're shutting it down, so that could just be like a gimme win.
Yeah.
But the only 2 like real gimme wins are the Spurs and the Hornets. And to be fair, they did lose to the Spurs the last time they played.
True.
So OKC's schedule is significantly tougher than the Nuggets or the Timberwolves. So they may relinquish potentially. Not saying they will, but they could potentially relinquish the 1 seed. Their point differential, right, is plus 7.4. So of those 3 teams, it's the highest one. But you just don't know. So
Yeah.
Then, as we already mentioned, Clippers 4, Pelicans 5. And then 6 through 10 is a doozy, right? Because obviously, even more so 6 through 8,
Yeah.
because I feel like 9 and 10 is probably going to stay that way.
You think
We'll
so?
start with, well, we'll see.
We'll get
But,
there. We'll get there.
but when you look at 6 through 8,
Mm-hmm.
they all have 29 losses. The
Sure.
Suns, the Kings, and the Mavs. I
Sure.
believe the Mavs have the tiebreaker over the Suns. But I think as of now, I think the Kings have the tiebreaker over the Mavs.
Okay.
Um, Now, the interesting thing is that the Mavs are going to play the Kings 2 more times, right? So that's a potential opportunity, for whoever wins those 2 games may have a chance, to potentially, leapfrog the other in the standings, right? Because those are the games that are really important because you give the other team a loss if you win, and then you add a win to your record,
Right.
right? So it's almost kind of like if you win, it's almost like the other team gets like 2 extra losses.
Yeah, and they get
Um,
knocked down a notch.
Right, exactly. So, and the Suns, compared to the Mavs, again, the Suns have the hardest remaining schedule in the NBA, right?
Joy.
Now, they did win the games that they were supposed to, right? Because they
Uh-huh.
had like a stretch where they played the Spurs, the Hawks, and I think the Hornets, right? So like they had, the stretch where they had the easy opponents. Then I think they play the Spurs one more time. Um, but after that, the remaining teams that they play, the Nuggets, the Thunder, the Timberwolves twice, the Clippers twice, the Pelicans twice, and the Cavs. So that's not
Yikes.
great.
Yeah, that's
The
tough,
Sacramento
bro.
Kings. The Sacramento Kings have the third hardest remaining schedule. The team with the second hardest remaining schedule is actually the Hornets, which is funny.
Wow.
But yeah, but the
Ironic?
Kings, right? They play Boston, OKC, the Clippers, the Pelicans, the Knicks, and the Suns, right?
Okay.
So that's another
It's
game. So
tough, bro.
that's another matchup, right? Where hey, that's a potential scenario where those two teams make their record could be determined by that matchup.
Yeah.
Um, and then you look at the Mavs, right? They have the 20th toughest schedule, right? So obviously the Mavs have the easiest remaining schedule
Mm-hmm.
of those. Um, although they have some interesting matchups of their own, right? They play OKC, they play the Kings twice, as I already mentioned. They play the
Mm-hmm.
Heat, they play the Rockets twice. We'll get to in a moment. And then they also play Golden State twice. So that's kind of where you get into that 9-10 matchup, right? Where, say, with the Lakers and Golden State, right? Golden State, has been 4-6 in their last 10. They just lost a game to Minnesota after losing a game to the Pacers, right? And they have one of the easier schedules remaining, in the NBA. They have the 25th hardest schedule. So they have the 5th easiest remaining schedule. But, in terms of their remaining games, they still play the Pelicans, they still play Orlando, they play Dallas twice, Miami, they play the Lakers one more time, and the Rockets, who now all of a sudden have kind of come into play, where they've won 8 straight games after losing Alperen Şengün, right? 9-1 in their last 10, right? So they had what, like one crazy loss where I can't remember who they lost to, but like it was just kind of like one of those games where it's like, wow. Um,
I think it
but
was
they
the, I think they lost to the Clippers.
Yeah, it was the game where they were up by 20
Mm-hmm.
in the game at one point, and then they blew the whole lead, and then the Clippers closed it out, right? So they could have
Yeah,
easily won 10 in a row.
easily.
And then it would be even more crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So now with the Warriors losing to the Timberwolves, they're one game behind. They're one game ahead of the Rockets, right? So, and there's going to be a game where they play, as I already mentioned, um, relatively soon. So there's a world where, those two teams all of a sudden where it would have been maybe a gimme game, right? Now it's kind of a competitive game where whoever wins, again, you get to hang a loss on the other team and you get an extra win on your own. And then that may push it even further, right? Because Golden State's 2 games above 500. The Rockets are 500,
Yeah.
right? And obviously the Lakers could factor in here as well. I guess they've been better than Golden State in the last 10, right? Obviously they had the loss where they where AD got hurt in the first quarter
Big deal.
against the Warriors, right? Which kind of changed the game, I think. So that was a loss, and they lost to the Kings. Um, but other than that, right? Like again, they've been better than Golden State in the last 10, but their schedule is much more difficult than Golden State's. Right now, to be fair, they're at 19, right? Because at one point they were like they had one of the 10 toughest schedules, but because some of the games that they played, like the Bucks and the Timberwolves, those are gone. They still do play the Bucks and the Timberwolves, one more time. They
Yikes.
also
Yeah.
play the Pacers twice. They play Golden State. They play New Orleans, and they play Cleveland. But those games are a little bit later, right? They're about to play the Pacers, and then after that they have a 6-game road trip But of the teams in the West, like of those top 10, they've been far and away the worst road team out of any of them, right? So that's where, like, okay, they're ahead of Golden State right now, but if they just play very poorly on the road, right, then all of a sudden that can shake things up, and then they drop right back down to 10. And then, of course, you look at Houston, right? Houston has the 11th hardest schedule. So their schedule is much more difficult than those other teams. And that's why I don't necessarily know if they're going to be able to make it. But, as a whole, right, they've been playing better than both of those teams in the last 10 games. I think they've had an easier stretch, but it doesn't matter, right? Like winning 8 in a row, winning 9 out of 10, no matter if it's like a lot of easy or tough teams, I think is still, not very easy to do,
Yeah.
right? Because again, again, we've seen both of those other teams, lose games that they shouldn't have lost to, right? Like we saw Golden State lose to the Knicks where the Knicks didn't have 3 starters. They had 2 guys basically play the whole game and they still lost, right? We
Yeah.
saw the Lakers, right, lose a game to the Kings, right, where they were up 20 in the first quarter, and then in the third quarter they're down 20. So we've
Yep.
seen that's the thing with all of these teams in that 6 to 10 range where because they've been inconsistent, that's why they are where they are, right? Like all of those teams from 6 to 10 have had stretches where they've been good, right? The Rockets at one point, right, were, in the top 6 in the Western
Yes.
Conference, right? Way back earlier in the season, right? Now, they've been kind of firmly entrenched in that 11-12 spot.
Yeah.
And now, after winning 8 straight, they're in a spot where, hey, they may actually be able to sneak in and kind of shake things up. And before you know it, you get like a LeBron, Dylan Brooks playing game.
Bro, I
Where,
don't want that. Dude, Houston can't ruin the greatest play-in of all time, right? Please don't.
yeah, or you get a Golden State, Dylan Brooks, Gary Payton,
Bro.
playing game.
Bro.
So you just don't know. But like I said, that's the thing with the Rockets where I just don't necessarily know if they're going to be able to do it only because their schedule is significantly tougher. But if you look at the way they've been playing as of late, right? It's the style of play where it's like very up and down, a ton of athletes, a lot more offensive firepower than it
Yeah.
was earlier in the season because they're just playing at a crazy pace. And they're still defending relatively well. So you just don't know, right? Because again, I think a week or so ago we wouldn't have expected the Rockets to be in this position.
No.
But do you ultimately think that the Rockets do kind of get into that 9-10 spot, or do you think it's probably going to stay LA Golden State? Because I feel like it's probably still going to be LA Golden State,
Okay.
but you just don't know. Because again, like, you know, you don't know. Because again, these teams, for every game that they've won, then they've lost some other games that they shouldn't have won. And like I said, that's why they're where they are right now.
Bro, I can't even lie to you. To answer your question, if Jalen Green continues to play like how he's played pretty much in his last 10 games, where he's averaging almost 30 points on 40% three-point shooting and 51 from the field, first of all,
Right.
that's the Jalen Green that I think everybody foresaw.
Yeah.
This is like his coming out party potentially.
Right.
And like you said,
Yeah.
I don't know if this is because of the pace change and how they're just playing like it's high school basketball, up, down, cherry pick, throw the lob, whatever the case may be. We do everything on the fast break. I don't know if that's, potentially why he's been balling on another level, or he's just figured something out and things are starting to click. I know the memes, we're not going to get into that, but it would not surprise me if Houston actually usurps, the Golden State Warriors, because the Golden State Warriors, they haven't looked all that amazing at times, but I still, you really don't want to bet against, Steph Curry. Like, I'm not going to pit the entire Warriors playing existence on Jalen Green, finishing out the season as pretty much like, most improved. Like, I'm not going to do that. But at the same time, I don't know, like, in their last 10, they've looked so good. Like, that's the problem. And like you said, it might be due to the quality of the teams that they were playing, but you still can't discredit that. For them to bounce back and be 35-35 without Şengün is kind of wild. And, that's not to say that Şengün's the problem. It's just more so of a thing like they're clicking, and it shows you kind of how hungry they are. Now, would it make all that sense? Would it make enough sense to, like, just do all this and go all in and then get to the play-in just to lose? Because we already know they're pretty much going to lose. But they don't have their pick, so I guess they're fighting for something. Like, I guess they need something to show for it.
That's the incentive because they don't have their pick. It goes to OKC. So really, so like even though they were way back in the standings, there was really never any real incentive to be that bad, right?
Right.
Because again, they don't have their own pick, so you're just helping out OKC. So they want, that's the other thing, right? Is that they want to make the playoffs. We don't know necessarily if they will,
Right.
right? But they have every incentive to do so because they don't have their own pick. And if these young guys can get that experience and see what it's like to be in a competitive playoff type environment, that could pay, some huge dividends for that team, right?
Yeah,
If
that
a
could be
guy,
career changing.
right, like if Jalen Green can actually get like legitimate, quote unquote playoff experience by either
Yeah.
being in a big play-in game or
Yeah.
just being in, like, even if they're the 8 seed and they get smashed by the Nuggets, right? That's still, for them better than just missing the playoffs outright,
Sure.
right? Like that's kind of what you would want if you're the Rockets. That's kind of all you could really ask for, and that's where the 8 game win streak is impressive. Because again, we've said that Şengün's basically been their best player this year, and so if you're without your best player and you've won 8 in a row and 9 of your last 10, that's impressive. No matter who you're playing and how you're doing it, like that's something that we wouldn't have expected, right? Because again, I remember a few weeks ago, we pretty much thought that both the Rockets and the Jazz were done. Now the Jazz are indeed done; like they've given
Yeah.
up,
Yeah.
right? So
Cancel the
like they're,
parade, bro.
yeah, they're basically cooked. But for the Rockets, like there's still a fighting chance, and again, they're gonna try. It's just the matter of their schedule is so much more difficult, and like all the teams that they're playing, those teams are going to be fighting for positioning as well, right?
Sure.
Like, like they're like one of the games that they play is the Magic, or not the Magic. Yeah, they do play the Magic, right? So like that's a team that's going to try to also fight as hard as they can to get a legitimate playoff spot. The Magic don't want to be in the play-in, right? Same with the Mavs, right? Like they don't want to be in the play-in either.
Yeah.
Same, and then like even a team like Minnesota who's not in the play-in, right? But they still want to win games because they'd still rather be, a 2 or 1 seed than the 3 seed, right?
Yeah.
They may not be able to get it. And that's kind of the crazy part of the standings because, a few seasons ago, right, when the standings I think were not quite as even, right? Where like there was a clear difference between like, okay, like there's no way we can actually catch this team. You would see some of the teams kind of like, jockey for positioning and standings. Like I guess we kind of saw it last year
A
in a
little bit.
way, but not really, right? Like I mean, like
Not to the extreme
everybody,
that you're talking about.
not like it was in the past, right? Like,
Yeah.
cause say like the Clippers, everybody was like, "What are you guys doing?" Trying to win games just to play the Suns in round one.
Yeah.
And like Kawhi and Paul George, they ended up getting hurt, but in that first game when Kawhi was playing, right, they actually looked pretty good. That you could have
Very.
made a case that if they were actually healthy, it might have been fine, right?
Yeah.
But and then you go into this season, right, where they've taken this season relatively seriously, right? But I remember, right, but a few seasons ago, right, they didn't do that, right? Like they, kind of changed the seating so that way they would avoid some of the other teams. Now they ended up making the conference finals that year, but that was without Kawhi, right? So it's like it didn't even really matter.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the thing that we saw in the past. But it's kind of tough to do that, and with the play-in, right? That's even tougher as well, right? Because if you're, in that 6 to 8 spot, and you think OKC is going to be the 1 seed, and you're like, I want to play them. Well, even if you finish 7-8, you still have a playing game that you have to deal with, and there's no way you're going to be like, okay, they're the 8 seed, so we need to lose the first playing game on
Yeah.
purpose and then win the, like. You're not going to do
That's
that
not
because
gonna happen.
yeah, that's just too much. There's too many questions and there's just too many variables at play where that just
Yeah.
doesn't make a
That's
lot of
just dumb.
sense. Yeah, it's dumb. That's the problem. Like
Yeah.
that's the thing is that it's just not smart. And again, for a lot of these teams, they need to kind of pick it up, right? Because like
Yeah.
I think Golden State kind of needs to pick it up. Now, to be fair, again, there's a reason why they have the 25th easiest remaining schedule. Because again, they do play the Spurs. To be fair, they've already lost to, but still, right? Like they do play the Spurs, they play the Hornets, they play the Blazers, and they play the Jazz twice. But even so, it's not like Orlando, Dallas, the Lakers, the Rockets, the Pelicans. It's not like those are all super easy matchups. So that's kind of the tough part. I think their upcoming stretch of games, right? Because they kind of had that stretch where like they played the Wolves, right? They played the Pacers, they played the Knicks. Like in between that was the Grizzlies. So I think if I'm not mistaken, their next few games are kind of where they're playing some of the easier like bottom feeder teams.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like it's still not a great position to be in. Like, well, yeah, their next actually no, their next game is against the Heat, and then their next game is against the Magic. So Then you have Charlotte and the Spurs. Then you play Dallas. Then you play Houston. Then you play Dallas again. So it's kind of spread out. So, there could be in a scenario where even if they just split, right? Like then you're already 2 games behind LA. Now LA could lose the next couple of games because their stretch is a little bit tougher, right? They play the Pacers and then they play the Bucks,
Hmm.
right? And they play the Bucks, in Milwaukee, right? So and they've not been a very good road team, but this has just been kind of crazy where, there's just a lot that could change, right? And again, ideally, if you're in that 7 to 10 spot, you don't want to be, 8, 9, or 10 because if the Nuggets do take the 1 seed, you're not getting out of the first round unless there's an injury.
Yeah.
So, because we don't have any evidence that any of those teams could beat the Nuggets in a 7-game series.
Heck no,
Maybe,
man.
yeah, exactly. So maybe one of those, maybe one of those 6 through 10 teams could beat OKC or Minnesota, but probably not the Nuggets, and also probably not in the first round when they've been
Absolutely.
playing, great basketball as of late. So that's kind of the tough part. I think if you're those teams, right? Because I think you would be hoping for OKC or Minnesota to get the 1 seed, but it might be the Nuggets. And if it is the Nuggets and you're in that, 9, 10 spot, like yeah, I don't know. That's not a great spot to be in.
Yeah, it's rough. I think the way that it's set up right now, where we have the Lakers and the Warriors and then the Sacramento Kings and then the Dallas Mavericks, I think this is on track and on pace to be potentially, one of the greatest play-ins of all time in terms of entertainment value. But like with Houston right on the Warriors' tails, I don't know. Like, and back to your original question, I think Houston is probably going to take it from them. I could just see it
And
now.
and then think about it like from the NBA's perspective.
Hmm.
If you want a play-in game between the Lakers and Warriors, you don't want it to be 9-10 because then
Heck
that means
no.
one of them goes home and then the other
Yeah.
one to play another one just to get in,
Right.
right? Because there's a world where like let's say you know one of them's 9, the other's 10, and one of them wins the first game. Well, what if the other one loses the 8-9 matchup? Then they're
Yeah.
both out of the playoffs,
True.
right? Like, and so then it's like, who cares, right? So that's kind of the thing there. But who knows? And that's why again, some of these games are going to be really pivotal because again, the Mavs and the Warriors play each other 2 more times. So if you're Golden State, those are 2 games that you kind of need to circle because if you can win those 2 games, you have at least a chance to maybe catch up to Dallas. I mean, now the issue is now they have 5 more losses than the Mavs, right? Which I think, with basically 12 games to go, I think that's really difficult to overcome. It
Yeah.
helps that you're playing that team twice, but that means you have to bank on them just having a horrible stretch to
They're gonna
end
have
the
to lose
season.
out pretty much.
Right, and that's the
Almost.
tough part of being, of having that many more losses because like even the Lakers, I don't think are going to be able to get to the 7-8 spot, but at least you can make the case that okay, it's 3 losses.
Yeah.
So like if one of those teams loses like 3, 4 in a row, you might have a chance. And again, like with a team, and Phoenix and Sacramento do have very difficult schedules to end the season, but because they're already 3 games ahead, they don't have to play as well, right? Like you know, Golden State or LA pretty much would have to win like set at a 70+% clip,
Yeah.
right? And that's we don't have enough evidence that either team is going to do that, right? That's kind of the difficult part. And then the tiebreakers also factor in because say the Lakers don't have the tiebreaker against the Mavs or the Kings, they have it against the Suns, but the Suns are further ahead than the Kings and the Mavs.
Yeah.
Golden State, they don't have the tiebreaker against the Suns, right? Because they lost to the Suns, I think 3 out of the 4 matchups. Um, and then I think they have a chance to, I think, tie the season series between the Mavs. I
Hmm.
think they split the season series between the Kings. I just can't remember who has like the better divisional record. It's probably Sacramento if I had to guess, because I think Golden State's record against some of the better teams is not as good as some of the other ones.
Yeah.
So that's the issue is that if you're Golden State and LA, you don't have the tiebreakers against a lot of these teams. Not to mention, what's doubly bad for LA is that they recently had games against most of these opponents, right? Like they had 2 games against the Kings, they had a game against the Suns. Um, and if you had won some of those games, and they had a game against Golden State. So if you had won some of those games, right, you could have possibly gotten closer. But losing all of those games is kind of brutal.
Yeah.
So, because and that's the tough part, right? Because again, like you mentioned, um, you know, even with Phoenix, right? These teams like Phoenix, Golden State, um, like you mentioned, they all are very expensive rosters, and
Yeah, bro.
I don't think you don't really feel good about having a super expensive roster being basically a play-in team because who do you think is going to escape the play-in? Right, that's
Right.
the other question I'll probably ask because I feel like of the Suns, the Kings, and the Mavs, it's probably Dallas because they have the easiest schedule.
Hmm.
But, you know, who knows at this point, right? Like that's the thing. Like, I mean, you can make the case for any of them because obviously the Suns have, the high end firepower up top. The Kings, because of the way they play, could kind of pop off on any given night. And then with the Mavs, you have Luca, right? And then, on top of that, you have Kyrie. And
Yeah.
those are two guys that, in close games, you feel really good about having on your team, versus like, even though the Suns have some guys that you should feel good about, they've been a terrible fourth quarter team. I think one of
Yeah,
the
it's
worst
ridiculous,
ever.
bro. Makes
So,
no
I mean,
sense.
right. So that's kind of the part where this is going to go down to the wire. And, I think, that's kind of an interesting prediction. So you have a hot take that you think the Rockets will take the 10 seed from Golden State. I mean,
Yep.
so
I'm thinking this is the script, all right? I'm thinking Houston takes the 10th seed away from the Warriors. Boom. Warriors are probably done. Unfortunately. As much as I would love to see, the Warriors and Lakers potentially compete in the play, and I don't think it's going to happen this year. And then I also think New Orleans is probably going to drop. I'm hoping that Phoenix will probably rise, and then I think Dallas might rise as well. But who knows? That's what I just think is going to happen, but that could be completely off. Anything could happen. Like the complete opposite could happen. Who knows? We'll get there when
yeah.
we get there, but I think, it's safe to say that somebody's getting moved, and I just don't
Yeah.
know who it would be outside of the Warriors.
And again, we mentioned 11 teams. So that means
Exactly.
three of these teams are not getting in,
Yeah.
as we already mentioned. So,
The playing is a
like,
whole nother thing, dude. I can't wait till
yeah,
we get to that for our predictions and
yeah.
things like that.
And again, you have a lot of talent in those playing games because, say,
Yeah.
for Phoenix, you got Booker, Durant, and Beal. For the Kings, you have Fox and Sabonis. The Mavs have Luca and Kyrie. The Lakers have LeBron and AD, and Golden State's got Steph.
Yeah.
So,
That's a lot of talent. That's loaded,
right?
bro.
So, yeah, exactly. Like, so that's and any of those teams could be. And then, the Rockets have Jalen Green, and,
True.
Fred Van Vliet, I guess. So, that's going to be kind of an interesting scenario because,
They've been
again,
hooping though, bro. Like
yeah.
it's crazy. Their numbers are wild.
Yeah, and again, that's an interesting scenario because again, the Rockets were not a team that we really were factoring into the equation. But give them a lot of credit because, like you mentioned, Jalen Green's been great, right? You got Amen Thompson basically playing like the role of a five,
Yeah,
kind of
which is
like a small ball five,
crazy.
right? Jabari Smith Jr. punching guys, playing hard, and
True.
all that
Getting
stuff.
ejected. Hey, Jalen
Right, but
Green's even hitting look away threes, turnarounds, and dropping 40 bombs on people. It's crazy.
right, and like you said, this is kind of the version of Jalen Green that you were hoping to get
Yes,
when they
bro.
drafted him is basically kind of like an explosive, really athletic scorer. And I think his defense has been better this year.
Sure.
The issue had been the efficiency had been so bad for most of the season, but you know, now he's up to, I guess a career high 42.6 from the field, 33.4 from three, right? But that's factoring in, this recent stretch where again, if you looked at those splits, right, it's way more efficient,
Yeah.
and it looks a lot better, right?
Yeah, it's
Because
crazy. He's playing like
for the
high
month of
school Jalen Green, bro, and that's the one
right,
that everybody thought he was going to be.
for the month of March, 28 points a game, 6 rebounds, 3.5 assists, 51 from the field, 42 from three, 80
It's
from the
crazy.
line, 64% true shooting percentage,
That's
which is
crazy,
insane.
man.
Yeah,
That's
exactly. So
otherworldly.
right, exactly. So I mean, that's insane. So, but
Yeah.
again, you give a ton of credit to, the Rockets for hanging in there and really competing and actually caring, right? And that's the difference obviously between the Rockets from the last couple of seasons versus this season is that this team actually gives, gives a what, right? Like they actually care. They play hard. Um, and it's a fun team to watch. Again, like, it sucks obviously that Shengun got hurt, but the fact that these other guys are still going to be able to get, some opportunities to play. And, Tari Eason's been out. I think Cam Whitmore's been out, right? So his
Mm-hmm.
rookie season seems like it's probably over.
Yeah.
Um, so again, they've been missing some guys and they haven't really missed a beat. This is the best stretch that they've had since the early part of the season. And again, like I said, I don't care who they're playing. Like, it's still impressive, right? Like,
Yeah.
maybe they don't make, that 10 spot, right? Because I still feel like they're probably not going to make it. But
Okay.
again, you just never know because
We'll see,
because
bro.
again, who would have thought they would have won 8 in a row? So, at a certain point, you kind of wonder, is Jalen Green, is this legit? Because hopefully, Shengun doesn't come back next season, and then all of a sudden he kind of starts
Bro,
reverting back.
if that happens, that's a bad sign already. I think
Right.
that means that you might have to move on from Jalen Green, honestly. But who
Right? Because
knows?
it's like, yeah, because like again, I don't necessarily I can't necessarily say that it's like, oh, well, they're better without Shingo. Like, no, that's
Sure.
not
I know
really the
you were
case.
joking.
Yeah, it's just like their games. It's kind of where it's just Jalen Green had struggled for so much of the year that it's just kind of wild how like all of a sudden this is the best he's ever played, and again, it just somehow coincidentally occurs right as Shingun went out. And to be
It's the
fair, I think he
difference
had
in
a couple of
pace, bro.
and like to be fair, I think he had a couple of games before the Shengun injury where he played well. But
Yes.
again, like you just mentioned, right? Like a lot of that is they're playing at a crazy pace, and like
He's a
that's
downhill player,
kind of
bro. You can't
yeah.
just sit
So
around and wait for Shengun to do his thing down low. Like,
right,
I just don't think that's like a great fit. Like, I think they're good together, but they could be better separate, honestly. That might be a
and
fair
that's
evaluation. Or it might be
right, and
too
that's
early.
kind of right, and that's kind of the intriguing part, about this team because again, you were hoping to get. Obviously, you kind of were hoping to get progression from both guys, but I think you were also really hoping to get something from Jalen Green because I think he had been seen as the more disappointing guy, especially because he was the number 2 pick, and he
Yes.
he had been and again like we had a higher ceiling initially projected for him than I think Shengun. A lot of people did.
Yeah, Jalen
Um,
Green was supposed to be the unicorn, bro. He's supposed to save that franchise.
right. So hopefully, right, this is closer to what I don't think you expect him to be a 30-point per game scorer for the Rockets, but if he can be like an efficient 20 plus per game scorer
Yes.
and like at least be solid defensively, right, and provide that athleticism, that's really what you would want, right?
50 from
Because
the field, low or high 30s from the three. That's all I really want.
yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, right? Because remember, there were some people that were kind of thinking, do we maybe trade this guy? Because that was a conversation that people were starting to have,
Even around the
about Jalen,
deadline.
right? Even last season, right? We had a guest, on our podcast talking about like, they should, they should think about, right? Like, Shengun is kind of an untouchable, but Green, maybe you think about moving on from him, right? Like,
Sure.
I think yeah, that was earlier in last season, but still, right? Like that's
Yeah.
something to think about. But now, maybe you don't move on from Jalen Green, and I don't think either of us like said like the Rockets should trade him at the trade deadline. Like, I mean, maybe in years past, maybe we might have seen like a crazier trade. I just don't think most teams would just give up on a guy like that now, right?
He's got
Like
so much
maybe,
upside, bro.
yeah,
Potential
like
upside.
right. It's just going to be interesting because again, you're going to get to a point relatively soon where you're going to have to pay him. And, because again, he's already at, towards the end of season 3. So technically, right, like his extension could come as soon as this upcoming off season. And if it doesn't, right, is that a scenario where maybe they decide, to kind of, do something where they move on? But who knows, right? Because obviously, you can't keep all these young guys because you're going to have to pay them eventually, right? And that's the tough
Yeah.
part, right? You assume that they're going to pay Shengun, but are they going to pay for both him and Green, and then eventually down the line Jabari Smith, right? Like all these guys, right? Like you're probably not going to be able to keep all of these guys. So if Green can show, hey, I'm really good, I should stick around, right? That would incentivize the Rockets to maybe do more. Or at the very least, if he plays really well, maybe you trade him for something. But I don't necessarily think we're there. Like I think at
Yeah.
least the good news is right now is he's playing great basketball and leading Houston to wins. And if they get into the play-in, right, like then you got to have real questions about like, okay, can this guy? Maybe this guy actually can be a real piece,
Because what if he
for
carries it over into the play-in? Like, what if
right,
he's dropping 40 bombs in the play-in? And in the
yeah.
playoffs, he pretty much keeps them, afloat against, whoever's going to be the number 1 seed.
Right. And that's kind of the funny thing about young guys is that, with young players, sometimes they may just all of a sudden kind of just figure it out at a certain point in the season when you least expect it. And then all of a sudden they go on a really strong stretch, like say like a Kaminga, right, was kind of up and down because we talked about it earlier in the season. We thought he was kind of a disappointment. And then all of a sudden right? Beginning in what was it like around December or January or whatever, right? He just has consistently basically been like a 20, point per game scorer, right? He's basically been like one of their go-to guys offensively.
Yeah.
And sometimes that just kind of happens over the course of a season where a guy just kind of figures it out. And then before you know it, he seems
Moving
like a keeper.
different, bro. Moving different.
Right, exactly. So, at this point, right, again, it was kind of funny because we thought that the 10 teams were pretty much what they were. Now
Yep.
it seems like Houston may slide in. The
Mm-hmm.
East, I think, is pretty much set in terms of those 10 teams. That's been done for a while. It's
Yeah.
just a matter of like, it's like what we've continued to say. The order may not be what it ends up being. Who do you think in the West picks up the 1 seed?
One seed.
Because,
Um,
yeah, because
that's the
Minnesota,
crazy thing. Like they're
right,
all coveted. Like it's a coveted spot. Like number one
right,
in either conference is coveted.
yeah.
Like you said, with home court advantage, but the way it's looking right now, I'll probably go with Denver, man. I don't think OKC has it in them to do it. And it's crazy. Minnesota was pretty much the number one seed for the majority of the season, but they've kind of fallen off a little bit.
Yeah, even though they've been 7-3 in their last 10,
Showed
right?
competitive, bro.
But the Thunder are 7-3 in their last 10, and then the Nuggets are 8-2. So like all three of the top seeds are playing well. It's
Yeah,
just Minnesota doesn't have the tiebreaker against the Nuggets. I think they have it against OKC, but I don't really remember. Um, but either way, it's kind of funny because they all have, the Nuggets and the Thunder have 21 losses, the Wolves have 22. So they're all basically a game within each other. So any of these teams, if they finish strong, could get the 1 seed. I don't think Minnesota like has a 0% chance of
sure.
getting the 1 seed. It's just obviously without Towns, the mission becomes a little bit harder. But again, when you look at Edwards' play as of late, right, he's been able to keep them afloat, right? Nas Reed being in the starting five now, right? He's another guy, right, that's kind of been able to step in and kind of do what Towns kind of does, you would normally do.
Hmm.
Um, it's a different, it's just normally he'd be the backup. But and then even like Mike Conley, right, in some of these games has kind of, been able to kind of give them some stuff, especially late in games, right?
Sure.
Like again, the Golden State game, right? Minnesota normally struggles to score late in games. I mean, to be fair, Golden State isn't necessarily great in crunch time either. But again, on one end you have Steph Curry, and then on the other end, right, you have, you know, a young guy in Anthony Edwards, right? And then, surrounded by, other than Conley, some other young-ish guys because Towns is out. I guess Gobert. But still, so, any one of those teams, I feel like I'm kind of with you where I feel like I'm starting to lean the Nuggets. And again,
Yeah.
we looked at the strength of schedules, right? And the Nuggets have the easiest one. And they have the tiebreaker against the Wolves, right? And if they beat the Wolves, just one of those times, right, then they probably are going to wrap it up anyways. So, and again, as we already mentioned, with if you're in that bottom part of the plan, you're hoping that the Nuggets don't get it, right? Because if
Yeah.
they do get it, you're not getting out of the first round,
Nope.
right? Like I don't think any of those teams would necessarily be quote unquote favored anyways against whoever finishes as the 1 seed. But I think you would have a very, very close to 0% chance if it's the Nuggets. I think you'd at least have like a decent shot if it's OKC or Minnesota. It still kind of depends on who it is that's the 8 seed, right?
Yeah.
Like one of those teams may have a better chance against Minnesota or OKC than one of the others. But the one team that you don't want to play is the Nuggets. Because if you
Yeah.
play the Nuggets, I mean, you might as well just sit everybody. I mean,
Like
they're not going to, but you know what I mean.
yeah, but like hypothetically speaking, right? Say Oklahoma City is the number one seed, just hypothetically, right? And then say, I don't know, Dallas becomes a seven seed, right? And then the Lakers become the eighth seed. I
Right.
think you would feel amazing if you are the Lakers, if you are playing
Right.
Oklahoma City. Like that's a team
Yeah.
where I think they can exploit, maybe the youth of the Oklahoma City Thunder in their
And the lack of
exactly.
physicality.
Exactly. Like I mean, I think earlier in the season we've even seen, Braun pretty much bully OKC to the point of no return. Where,
Yeah.
LeBron looked like he was back in his Heat days. So, I'm very curious to see how it's gonna shape up. But like you said, if Denver really tries and like actually gets this 1 seed, can we just crown them champs already at this point?
Right. Yeah.
That's how I
And
feel.
that right.
Genuinely.
And that's the issue is that it's up in the air, right? So,
Yeah.
that's why all these teams, it's important to win as many games as you can. So that way you don't have to be in that scenario. Because again, it does feel like the Nuggets are probably going to be the 1 seed. Now, again, if the guys get hurt and they end up having to miss a couple of games and then they end up losing a couple of games that they could have won, that can obviously make a significant difference, right?
Hmm.
Just like OKC's been healthy all year. Obviously, Minnesota lost town, so that makes it tougher for them because it seemed like they were going to get the 1 seed.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the thing, right? And again, it's not that OKC or Minnesota can't win any of those first round matchups. It's just you give the lower seed a shot just because of what they can do, right? Like you give the Lakers a shot against OKC or Minnesota because even though those teams record wise are close, I don't think their ceilings are as high as the Nuggets, right? Like we
Right.
already know the Nuggets ceiling is a championship because we just saw them do it last year, and it's basically the same team aside from a couple of other guys that have stepped in to replace some others. Um, Whereas with OKC, like, yeah, it's a lot of the same guys, but these guys have never been in a playoff situation before, other than I guess the play-in. So, like you said, you don't know how they're going to play. Um, and it's a much smaller team, right?
Yeah.
So, against a team like LA, may not necessarily struggle as much against a team that doesn't really have a lot of size or physicality to match up with them. But if it's the Nuggets, right, then that's not going to happen, right? That's just not going to work, right? And, same with all the other teams, right? Like, I don't think if the Mavs are the 8 seed and the Nuggets are the 1 seed, I don't think the Mavs are going to be able to beat the Nuggets, right? Maybe
Yeah.
you give them a shot to potentially, like, outscore them late in games because of Kyrie and Luca, but I don't think anybody would pick the Mavs to upset the Nuggets just because I think with the Nuggets, I think you have a much higher floor than the Mavs, right? Whereas like the Mavs may have a solid ceiling, but like, the floor is just lower because they're just not as good. They
Yeah.
have a
Who's stopping
superstar.
Jokic, bro?
Yeah, they have a superstar, right? So obviously that allows you to, have, a higher ceiling than you would, right? Like, because, Luca is a guy where you can kind of just elevate a roster because of how great he is. But, you know, at the same time, do I really think they're going to be able to beat the Nuggets? I don't see it. So if the Nuggets get the 1 seed, I think it becomes much more likely, like you said, that they, I don't know if cakewalk their way out of the West is what I'm trying to say, but like if they're the 1 seed, I think it's much more likely that they're going to be able to cruise, towards the finals and maybe win the championship. Because I feel like maybe it depends. Because obviously you don't want to count out Milwaukee, but we saw the Nuggets play the Celtics. To be fair, it's the regular season, not the playoffs. But I feel like some of Boston's issues may be more exploitable if they play the Nuggets than if it's like some other team. So that's the
Yeah.
issue. So.
Yeah. This is we're in for a postseason of the ages. I think I'm really just kind of itching and scratching and hoping that this can kind of like speed up because the build up kind of is getting a little tedious because every time that we do talk about the standings they are changing. I guess that's the beauty and the madness in it where like it's getting a little tedious to talk about, but the outcome I think is going to be super rewarding because we're going to get entertained regardless. But man, the standings are rough, all over the place. It's so competitive and I'm very curious to see who's going to come out on top.
Yeah, I mean, that's the crazy part because again, like there's a lot of different conversations to be had. Obviously, just because there's a lot of cool stuff going on. As we get closer and closer to closing out the NBA season.
Yeah.
In terms of news rumors, right? Really, nothing obviously as of late, right? I know there's had been sort of a report from the Athletic about Tibbs, the Knicks coach wanting an extension, right? Makes sense, right?
Hmm.
Obviously, the Knicks aside from that 1 year for the most part have gotten better, each year they've added more talent. Um, we'll see if he gets it, right? Maybe some of it depends on how the Knicks do, right? Like if they kind of just flame out and don't play as well, maybe he doesn't get it. But I mean, if they continue to do well, I don't see a reason not to because I think he's been good for the Knicks. Obviously he has his, interesting quirks in terms of playing guys, a lot of minutes.
48.
Um, but at the same time, I think he has kind of, obviously along with Brunson, like, kind of helped build, sort of like a culture and
Yeah.
just like a style in with the Knicks, right? Where it's like you're playing hard, you're playing tough, you're gonna play defense. So I think he's been a good get, for the New York Knicks. So, if he's got a chance to get an extension, he might as well. Obviously, we'll see what happens in the playoffs. But either way, I don't see a reason why you wouldn't. Like I said, unless they just kind of fall flat on their face.
Yeah, he's been the catalyst for their success, to be honest, alongside, Brunson and the additions that they've made. But I mean, you really got to love the system that he's created there. That's kind of how all of his teams have really been. Defensive oriented. They fight for everything. And that's the kind of culture I think you would want. And I think that's what the New York Knicks were missing for a long time. I think a lot of people considered the team soft. They had no drive, yada, yada, yada. We've heard it all. But now, they've arrived and they're back to relevancy, which I think is great for all of basketball. So I think he deserves this extension if that's what the rumor is going on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts, on those injuries. Uh, and then also the play-in, right? And the standings, right? Like, who do you think is gonna grab the 1 seed in the Western Conference? Who do you think, is gonna finish strong and either avoid the play-in, or maybe sneak into the play-in? In the case of the Rockets, obviously, again, keep in mind, we have a Discord, so don't forget to join that. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you comment, we will read it at the beginning, of our next video, and we'll see you Friday.